So we've got a really tasty recipe for you today. So what we've got planned is a sourdough baked brie stuffed with garlic and rosemary. Absolutely gorgeous. Bit like a cheese fondue. We're going to bake it in the oven. The whole wheel of cheese stuffed in the center. It's going to be soft, oozy, and you're going to break off that lovely crusty sourdough, dip it straight in, and just get really tucked in. A really lovely one to use for Christmas, the festive season, and it's really simple to put together. It will actually look like I'm using an awful lot of flour for just a small amount of cheese. But if we're going to the effort of actually making this dough, we might as well make a little bit extra, which will allow us then to actually bake a loaf of bread with it. So we might as well make the most of it. And with this recipe, again, we're going to keep it really, really simple. So kind of no faffing around. We're not going to go down the road of autolays and stretching and folding too much, because let's be honest, as we get into the festive season, we want to be able to spend our time with family, want to be able to relax. So we don't want to spend too much time working over our dough. So I'm going to keep it really easy. So straight up, all we're doing is 600 grams of strong flour. Straight in then, we're using 400 mils of water. And then for this recipe, you will need an active sourdough starter. So I'm using 200 grams of sourdough starter. So you'll see that my one looks a little bit darker because this is a rye starter, but if you have a white starter culture, that's absolutely fine too, no problem whatsoever. So with this starter, I prepared this about 8 to 10 hours ago. So probably last night really, I just kind of made sure it was fed, so it's lovely and active. So it's what we call our leaven. So I simply took 100 grams of starter, I mixed in 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water, stirred it together, so it's lovely and bubbly, lovely and active, ready to make my bread. And that again is going to go straight in. And the great thing about this recipe is we're actually going to make the dough the night before, especially if you're planning this over the holidays, Christmas morning. You don't want to be spending the whole day making bread dough. You have enough to be doing. So it's great that it can actually be prepared in advance. All in. And then to that, we're adding 12 grams of sea salt. Of course, you can knead this recipe by hand. I'm going to take the easy route today, and I'm actually going to use the mixer. So we're just going to start the mixer off, and you want to keep it at kind of a slow to medium speed because we don't want to generate too much heat within our dough. So a nice gentle mix, about 4 to 5 minutes to begin with. So while our dough is mixing, I'm going to give you a little sense of kind of what we're actually planning with this dough. As I say, I'm making a little bit of extra dough to allow me to make a loaf of bread, which is going to be great for the turkey sandwiches when the Christmas leftovers. And then the rest of the dough we're actually going to bake. So you can use some brie, you could use a wheel of camembert. The one thing I do recommend is say that you try to use a whole wheel of it, because we actually need the rind of the cheese to keep it all trapped in as it bakes. Kind of taking the cheese board, your Christmas cheese board, to the ultimate level. So our dough has been mixing for the last 4 to 5 minutes. So you can see it's starting to come together, but it is quite a soft, wet dough. Literally what we're going to do is just going to give it a mix for about a minute on a nice high speed. Just give it a really quick pull together, and that is it done. Now, our dough is all lovely and developed, nicely kneaded. So I need to get it out of the bowl. So when it comes to handling your dough, a little bit of oil on your hands makes your life much, much easier. It kind of stops everything sticking to you. I'm just using a little bit of vegetable oil. So you can see the dough, it's beautiful and smooth, lovely and elastic, and that's kind of exactly what we're looking for. As I say, if you don't have a mixer, you can quite happily knead this by hand. You might find that the dough is a little bit wet, a little bit sticky, but do resist that temptation to add flour, because if you keep adding flour, the dough will quite happily soak it up, and then your dough just becomes heavier and heavier. So you can bring the dough together, and very simply, we're just going to pop it into a clean bowl. Again, a little drop of oil into the bowl. You can just rub that in. That just again just stops the dough from sticking to the bowl and makes your life much easier when it comes to getting it out later. We're going to simply pop our dough in. And then we're going to let it prove at room temperature for about an hour, and then it's straight in the fridge overnight. So just while it's sitting at room temperature, do cover it over. You can use a tea towel, you can use some cling film. It's just to stop a skin forming and stopping the dough drying out. So you can pop that to one side. And the following morning when you come back to your dough, this is kind of what you're looking at. The dough is lovely and fermented, and we're going to just turn it straight out onto the table. And by using the fridge, it just kind of allows us to make life a little bit easier. It means you can do all the hard work the day before. You're not kind of getting up and spending hours over a dough and waiting for it to prove. While you're sleeping, waiting for Santa to arrive, your dough is doing its thing. So once you turn it out, just knock the dough back. Very simply just looks like knocking the air from it. Simply bring it back into a nice little bowl. That is it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to portion our dough. As I say, we made a little bit extra purposely because we want to have enough to make a little loaf and then enough to do our baked brie. Simply for our loaf, we want about 650 to 700 grams. And then the remaining, which will be about 550 grams, we're going to use for our cheese. So when it comes for shaping both those, we're just going to shape them to an initial little round first. Everything kind of starts from a round base, and then from there you can manipulate it and change it any way you like. So very simply, all I'm doing is taking all the little edges and letting each one overlap the last. And you can see the dough naturally starting to curve around. Give it a little roll around. We'll just pop it onto our table. Again, you can see I'm not really using any flour at all. If you find the dough a little bit wet and sticky, instead of kind of pushing loads of flour onto the table, a little bit of flour on your hands, even just flour your fingertips, you might find it a little bit easier. 3 or 4 times all the way around, a little roll around. So what you can do now is we're going to leave our dough to rest. So it needs to sit on the table for about 10 to 15 minutes because we've just knocked the dough back. We started to work the gluten. The gluten's all tightening up. So by letting it rest, it allows that gluten to relax, and then we're going to find it much easier to give it its final shape. So I am going to be going for kind of an oval shaped loaf. So I'm using my little proving basket here. You can shape your loaf round, you can pop it in a tin, whatever you like. Absolutely no problem whatsoever. So just a little bit of flour on the table. So we've already kind of pre-shaped our dough. So all I want to do now is simply take the 2 sides, nice and gently stretch it out and fold one over the other. A bit like an envelope. From the bottom, fold into the top, and you come over again and must tuck it back in on itself. So you can see I don't really handle the dough very much, it's just simply bring it together. So a little rub of flour over the dough, and then I'm just going to flour my basket to make sure the dough doesn't stick. And so very simply then, the dough goes into the basket upside down. And the reason we prove it upside down, so when it comes to baking the loaf, we simply turn it straight over onto our tray and into the oven, so it's right way up. So that's our little loaf. So we'll pop that to one side. So with the remaining dough, very simple, we just need to roll it, shape it to a round, and then we're going to let it prove. So if I was just to shape that now and to put it onto a baking tray, because it'll be proven for probably at least the next 2 hours, you would find that the dough starts to spread and could become quite flat. So we're going to prove it in, traditionally in bakeries we would prove it in a material called couche. It's kind of like a stiffened linen, but you can simply improvise. You can just use a tea towel. So on our baking tray, so the idea, it'll kind of helps the dough to hold its shape, and then a little dusting of flour again, stop, with a little roll around, and then it goes in to our cloth, and you can tuck it up both sides and just kind of pin it together. So it's simply just going to hold the dough into shape. A little dusting of flour on top, and again we're just going to prove at room temperature. We'll come back to that. Just depending on how warm your room is, it might be an hour and a half, and how active your dough is. So we'll check it after an hour, we'll see where we are, and then we'll finish the dough off and we'll incorporate our cheese. So we're just going to check on our doughs. They've been proving for probably just over an hour so far. So we can see with our loaf, it's growing nicely. Probably going to need about at least another hour and a half before it's ready to bake. But for our baked brie, what we want to do at this point now is we're going to transfer the dough out and onto our baking tray. A little bit of flour. If you're ever fearful of your dough sticking, don't be afraid to use a little bit of parchment paper or dusting with flour. So with our dough, as we kind of proved it upside down, nice and gently, Just going to transfer it onto our tray. So we're going to take, as I said, a full wheel of cheese. So into the center and just work a little bit of pressure to help work that in. So with the cheese then, what we want to do is we'll make a couple of little insertions, and then we're going to stuff them with kind of little slivers of garlic and pieces of rosemary. Of course, if you're not like a fan of garlic, this is completely optional. You could literally just go with the cheese just by itself. And you could use any kind of strong herb. So we're going to let it prove again for about maybe another 45 minutes. Just allow the dough to recover and let it come up a bit up around the sides, and then we're going to bake it. So our sourdough stuffed with brie, garlic and rosemary is ready to bake. So we're just going to get it into the oven. So simply then, just before it goes in, I'm going to just finish with a little bit of sea salt, a little bit on the bread. I preheated the oven to 220 degrees. I've also put a roasting tray in the base of the oven because I want to give a blast of steam into the oven as we load our bread in. So I've got a boiling kettle and a roasting tray preheating the base of the oven. And then we're going to bake it for about 25 minutes. So our bread is baked. The cheese, you can see it just wobbling away. So basically you've got a sourdough with our baked brie stuffed with garlic and rosemary. So we're just going to let it cool a little bit, just because it's going to be molten hot before we tuck in. So while our baked brie is cooling, I'm just going to get our loaf into the oven. So just before it goes in the oven, I want to score it. So I'm using a razor blade. So literally nice and confident when you're doing it. So as well as aesthetics, it's going to help control how your bread rises. So same again, if you do, I'm going to be actually baking this one underneath a glass dome, which I'm going to have to trap the steam in. But if you don't have something similar, like our Dutch oven, same as the way in which we bake the brie, roasting tray preheated, boiling kettle, lots of steam. For this one, I just turned the oven up a little bit higher. So you look about 240 degrees. It's going to bake for about 35 minutes.